Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO of PRI, and with me is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Ro. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. Well, Tim, we're veteran communications pros, so we've got to talk about the Trump-Zelensky blowout on Friday. And all depending on where people politically lean, in my opinion, their crowd rallied to their man. The MAGA crowd supported President Trump and J.D. Vance. Republicans who are not fans of Trump just shook their heads and cringed. And of course, the Dems rallied behind Zelensky. The way I see it, there's fault all around. Nobody kept their cool. My take is that this could be, another chip in the armor of this administration. 80% of Americans support the plight of the Ukrainian people. The U.S. bullying and belittling their president is not a good optic. That said, it's true that they'll likely never ever win the war and regain their territory. So the winner here is Putin. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. Nobody looked good in that meeting. When you go into any setting, it doesn't matter that it's a foreign policy discussion or it could be any meeting you have, right? You got to be able to kind of read the room. You got to have know who you're meeting with, what makes them tick, what you do or say or propose. What is it that's going to appeal to them most? And I think Zelensky went in and was determined to kind of continue his thing that he's been doing all along, that sure Biden went along with and the Europeans went along with, but obviously Trump's not into. Started with the little things, right? Like his little military fatigues that he wears. Right from when he arrived at the White House, Trump looks at him and says, "Gee, look at that. He decided to dress up today." That's yeah, it's petty to say, well, the guy was kind of laughed at because he didn't wear a suit. But if you know that's a thing, show up in a coat and tie. And then apparently he had all kinds of pictures he wanted to show, and there was the kind of, lecturing way that he went around him. And he was not wrong on the points that he raised. But the issue is you're trying to get people to go along with you. You're trying to get a security guarantee. And Trump is right. Trump is all about the art of the deal. He doesn't have a lot of cards to play. It was like he approached this deal without actually studying who he was going to be talking to and knowing what would be appealing to them. Compare that to Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who came a day or two before. What was the first thing he brought out? I have a letter from King Charles inviting you to an unprecedented second state visit. That was the most brilliant thing he could have done. Why? Because Trump loves all that. He loves the royal family. His mom was born in the United Kingdom. The royal family was very important to her. They didn't have any fireworks where you thought him and a Labour prime minister might, because he did his homework. He read the room. So I think that was really the biggest failure of Zelensky. I think too there were other issues, right? Like there might have been a little bit of a language barrier issue. Could he really have engaged effectively like he could? Because English, I think, is not even his second language.
Yeah, it's a wonder why they didn't have a translator right next to him in such an important occasion, a press conference of sorts. And it's really a failure on their part not to be able to give him the exact information that, he was negotiating and Trump and J.D. Vance. It's really quite something.
That's right. And to, when you go to those kind of meetings and Roe, you were there in the Reagan White House. You didn't go to those meetings where you're actually going to haggle and negotiate these things.
Oh no, it's a ballet. It's all orchestrated behind the scenes. And so
Yes,
it's crazy to have them blow up. Yeah, I've never seen anything like it, because all of those camera appearances are icing on the cake. All the nitty-gritty, and if there were any kind of blow-ups or disagreements, it would have happened behind the cameras, and there would have been a all smiles, in front of the world.
that's right. You're going in for a show, And so that to me was kind of a weird thing of what did you think was going to happen? You know, Donald Trump wants one thing, the minimal rights. And if you're coming in peddling something else, or you're going to think you're going to blow this up at the last minute, or, appeal to, his sense of, well, come and see what we're going to see, you're just not going to, you have no idea who you're dealing with here. And now look at the aftermath. The polling that's come out kind of initially, you know, Americans do feel like he insulted the country, coming into the Oval Office and saying that, even though they're sympathetic to him, there is not a blank check. And that's the feeling, right? Is that this guy is continuing to ask for a blank check. Americans want this to end, and they want the American tax dollars to stop going to Ukraine. Remember, Joe Biden got annoyed. It was kind of underreported, but Joe Biden got annoyed during calls and had some lashing out with Zelensky on some of the past phone calls with him. So this isn't an isolated incident with Zelensky and his negotiating style. But I think the worst thing, if you're Zelensky, look what happened in Europe over the weekend when they had that big summit in England with all the European leaders. Basically, they're committed to, hey, you got to sign the mineral deal with the United States. You got to keep the United States on board to land this plane. And so if he thought he was going to get something different, I think he was either vastly overplayed his cards, so to speak, from the language of the meeting, or he just doesn't understand how to negotiate with people.
Tim, you're a communications pro. What do you think Zelensky ought to do now to mend fences?
Well, you've got to show that you get it, right? Because even your staunchest defenders like Lindsey Graham, I think there was no stronger defender of his than Lindsey Graham, basically said, got to change leaders. So you just can't go around the United States. Even though there's a lot of change in foreign policy going on right now, you've got to, at the end of the day, make a deal. And you may feel like he's taking advantage of Ukraine, or, it's too much of a price to pay. But you basically have to make a deal with Donald Trump. So I think you gotta, as painful as it is, you gotta say, hey, I'm willing to deal. You gotta go in, and the answer is, where do I sign? And you gotta study Donald Trump and looks at, what appeals to him. And, I think if you do all of those things, Donald Trump wants to make a deal. You also got to realize, too, that, there's been a lot of talk, right, of only Donald Trump can bring all these people together in the room and make a deal. I think rhetorically and through, whatever he can offer in a deal, basically, Ukraine's future is in the hands of Donald Trump. And you got to realize that. And yeah, pride may be at play here, which I think is a lot of it. But you got to realize that basically Trump's going to be the guy to make you a deal that doesn't result in the annihilation of your country. And you may not like some of the things, but that's basically what it's going to take.
Yeah, I mean, this is already strike two for Zelensky. I don't think JD Vance or Trump forgot his little foray to Pennsylvania, hanging around with the Democrats during the campaign. So that didn't sit well with them. And then now you have this. I definitely think that he got to lay low for about a week and then call the president and make amends and say something, say to the public that there was some misunderstanding and we would love the deal, and work it out with their press people, some backroom deal where everybody again comes out smiling, sort of, and cut that deal.
You're exactly right. And maybe trade out your military fatigues for a red, white, and blue sweatshirt. Because I
Yeah.
think that's a lot of it too, right? Is you've got to be, we love America, thank you, America, thank you, America, thank you, Donald Trump.
Right. And it worked well 2 years ago, 3 years ago when he was in hiding and say he can't get a suit and tie. But now it's a little worn thin, and he just does. You look disrespectful. You go to the White House, you wear a suit and tie, and he easily could have done that. Well, let's move on. So, hey, we've got a little competition from the governor on our podcast, Tim. So he's starting a podcast. And now, from what I read, he's going to have guests from all sides, as he says. And his inspiration is Bill Maher, who's criticized the Dems on their woke policies. I'm wondering if Newsom is now beginning to back off his Trump-proof agenda. Frankly, I don't think so. It's just another way to talk, literally, from both sides of his mouth. Um, if he does indeed have conservatives, it's his way of trying to look inclusive in people's eyes. Tim, I think you and I should try to get on the show.
Well, it certainly would be interesting. We wouldn't be able to say much if we were guests on his program because Gavin Newsom is a guy who bloviates. And Gavin Newsom is a guy who I've seen him speak at events. He goes on and on and on and on. If you could let him speak for 5 hours, he would. Some of his budget press conferences have gone on literally close to 3 hours. And so, I think my initial reaction on this, remember, this is his second podcast, not his first. Um, it's nice to know that he's rebuilt LA from the wildfires and solved homelessness and has plenty of time to do a podcast. I think most Californians are looking at this, and he says this is essential to his work. Okay. He's certainly not going to learn moderation or humility from talking to people who disagree with him. I think what this is all about, right, is he's going to have on probably not the best MAGA spokespeople. Maybe he'll have some people who are a little boorish, where Gavin always comes out good. And they're going to go back and forth and they'll spar, and Gavin will lecture to them about how they're wrong. And, they'll be set up, though, as kind of the straw man of they don't know what they're talking about and they're this and they're that. And then at the end of the day, Gavin will want to show, but we're all buddies and we agree, but we can go have a beer afterwards. I think it's more the kind of phoniness that he's putting out there as he tries to gear up to run for president in 2028. But I think most Californians are going to look at this and say, what on earth are your priorities? Are you promoting yourself or are you doing your job as a governor?
Yeah, I totally agree. Nevertheless, I'm still going to check it out. So,
Apparently,
Tim,
his first guest is going to be, I just saw on Twitter, apparently his first guest is going to be the radio host Michael Savage. So that should
oh,
be an interesting
gosh.
discussion to see there. But Ro, I think you and I would never be invited on this show because we know what we're talking about, right? We would have valid points to go after Gavin on his records and public pronouncements, and we have data to back it up. And that's not who he wants to talk to on this show, I don't think.
So, Tim, how about introducing our next guest?
So today we just had a terrific webinar with our Sally Pipes in conversation with our Dr. Wayne Weingarten. And they're talking about Sally's terrific new book, which has been an Amazon.com #1 new release in different categories. And it's called The World's Medicine Chest. And basically, the book is about this kind of push by Democrats and even some Republicans pushing for these policies like prescription drug price controls and international pricing indexes and things like that in the name of, well, we're going to lower prescription drug costs for consumers. But as Sally makes the case in the book, it actually is one of the worst things that we could do if you want continued American dominance in pharmaceutical innovation and the continued availability of life-saving medications and all of that. So it's a really good, interesting discussion across the board on these issues and a very timely one, as when we're talking about things like repealing the Inflation Reduction Act, this would be one of the things that could be on the table in that repeal or reform effort. So it's a very interesting discussion and very important one, especially if you, like most Americans, have a medicine chest full of prescription meds. You'll want to pay attention closely to this episode.
Thanks so much, everyone. And here's the president of PRI, Sally Pipes.
Just released from Encounter Books. Read the new book from PRI's Sally Pipes, The World's Medicine Chest, available now at your favorite online bookstore. The World's Medicine Chest explores how America became the world's leader in biopharmaceutical innovation through market capitalism. But as Sally Pipes writes, America is the last best hope for millions around the world who are battling rare diseases and chronic conditions. As you'll read in the World's Medicine Chest, we can do more to fight and cure disease, but only if we continue to embrace private sector innovation over government regulation. Buy the World's Medicine Chest today at Amazon.com or your favorite online bookseller.
It's really great to be here and an honor to be interviewing Sally. Not only is she my colleague, I've learned so much about healthcare from her. She really is just a brilliant, brilliant health economist. And this book is fantastic. And I guess I'd like to kick things off talking about kind of why this book is so important. And I guess with a broad question to Sally of, well, why she decided to write this book and kind of what do we hope to achieve by publishing it?
Well, thank you, Wayne. Wayne and I, of course, are partners in crime, and we've been doing a lot of work causing trouble around the country and everywhere on our work on drug pricing and healthcare in general. Well, I decided to write this book because I've been involved in healthcare reform since 1988 when I lived in Vancouver, Canada, and worked at the Fraser Institute. So I've been pushing for market-based reforms and explaining to the American people after I moved here in 1991 why a complete government takeover of our healthcare system, i.e. Medicare for all, single payer, would be disastrous for all of us as patients and for doctors. So I want to empower doctors and patients. So that's how I sort of got into this. And I'm completely passionate about saving our healthcare system, as Wayne knows, and he is too. And so back, in April of 2020, COVID, the pandemic started. And by December of 2020, through Operation Warp Speed and Pfizer and Moderna, about 70% of people around the world had received their first vaccination. And the pharmaceutical industry seemed to be like everyone was loving the pharmaceutical industry. But, by August 2022, things had changed. People were becoming skeptical of big pharma, as they call it. And so in August of 2022, then President Joe Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, a major part of it, of course, being price controls on Medicare Part D and B drugs, starting with the first price controls on 10 drugs in January of 2026, and then 15 drugs have just been named for Part D, January 2027. So I'm very upset about this because I've seen what price controls have done to research and development in Europe in particular, and how that all ended by 2004 because of price controls, and because of Canada, how there's always a shortage of drugs, and many of the drugs that we have here in America aren't even on the formularies in Canada. So I have too much time on my hands, I guess. So I had to write a book and cause Wayne heart failure. So anyway, there we are.
I would say you're too productive, but you mentioned Europe, and I think that's a really great place to start our discussion, because I don't think people recognize that the US, we weren't always the global leader in pharmaceutical development. We are now, and there's so many benefits from it, but that wasn't always the case, that Europe was once the global leader. And so I thought it might be helpful to kind of describe how Europe came to be the global leader, and then kind of a follow-up to that, then what happened?
Well, yes. So, Europe, of course, America was a new country in 1776. So, there wasn't as much going on as there had been in Europe. The countries in Europe, of course, very old. And the pharmaceutical, I think, revolution started in the 1860s in Germany when Friedrich Bayer started his work on doing dyes, and they discovered something interesting, which led to the discovery of aspirin in 1899. So that was a big start, the discovery of aspirin. But before that, even Dr. Jenner in England was the person who found the smallpox vaccine, which really has eradicated smallpox around the world. So that was in the UK. And then we saw penicillin was, a great drug, was discovered, and it was sort of approved during World War II, towards the end of the World War II. But in the meantime, America started taking over the research on and development of penicillin, because there was the war effort in the UK was very costly, and so the scientists, several of the scientists, moved to the U.S., and so that was really the start of America becoming, the world's medicine chest, as I call it in my book. And so, then these countries, Britain brought in the National Health Service in 1948, so the government takeover of healthcare, although they did allow private care. Then France, Germany, all of these countries started introducing wage and price controls on pharmaceuticals because healthcare and the costs were getting out of control. So by 2004, every country in Europe had price controls on pharmaceuticals. Then by 2005, 80% of research and development on drugs was taking place in America, not in these countries, because the name brands that everyone knows, Novartis, GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca, Roche, they all left. The companies stayed in these countries, but they did their R&D in America because, as I keep saying, and it's people don't talk about this at the dinner table, but it costs about $2.8 billion from an idea, getting a patent applied for, to getting a drug to market. It takes about 12 years on average to get through all the clinical trials, the FDA, and then, of course, only 1 in 10 drugs makes it. So because we haven't had price controls, although I just mentioned under IRA, this is getting the camel's nose under the tent. And I'm hoping that the White House under Mr. Trump is going to start focusing on why the price controls on drugs under IRA are a bad idea, and then maybe convincing Congress to repeal that law before all these price controls come into effect.
And I think that's actually a really great perspective, just the damage that price controls did to not just patients and these other factors, but and you document in the book that that's part of what chased companies out of Europe, and the fact that there were no price controls here, that the industry started to grow, and there's all sorts of not just health benefits, but a lot of economic benefits that we've been able to receive because of that development. And I think, and there are all sorts of negative headlines about price controls, and and drug markets, and we'll definitely get into that in a little bit. But I thought it might be useful to kind of stay focused on the positive in terms of, as you call, we're the world's medicine chest. So what are the benefits we get because we are the world's medicine chest?
First of all, it's very good for employment. This industry employs a lot of people. Spending in 2023 on drugs in this country was $449 billion. So, and the good thing I think about the pharmaceutical industry and biotech and the biosimilars and things is that, if you have several years ago, if you had gallbladder issues or you had high cholesterol, I mean, these were debilitating things that made it so that maybe you couldn't go to work, or you weren't that productive, or you went to the hospital and had surgery and anesthetic, which is always risky. So pharmaceuticals have allowed people to, with high cholesterol and these things, to actually take drugs and lead very productive lives without having to, be hospitalized or just unable to work or only work part-time. So it's very efficient for us as patients to be able to benefit from so many of these drugs.
And the drug, correct me if I'm wrong, but the drugs are also, because they developed here, because we don't have price controls, the needs of the U.S. patient are prioritized in their innovation decisions, because in the U.S. is where you actually can cover, you said $2.8 billion. That's where they can cover those costs here in the U.S.
Well, exactly. And of course, these drugs are under patent protection for 20 years from when they file their patent application. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, they're trying to reduce the time for patent protection on small molecule drugs to 9 years and to 12 years on the biologics. But, the RAND Corporation came out with a very interesting study showing that between 2018 and 2022, in the US, in their study include the US and 26 other OECD countries, 74% of 287 drugs that were launched in that time period, 74% were available in this country at the end of 2022. But in Canada, where I'm from, only 28% were available. The UK had 43%. So, we have access to these drugs because we don't have price control. So I think the research showing how many drugs that were launched were actually available here in this country, and how sad it is that in other countries, a lot of these new drugs aren't available. In Canada, for example, the Fraser Institute, where I worked, they have shown that in any one period of time, there's a shortage between 1,500 and 2,000 drugs on any one day. And of course, drugs in Canada, the United States drug industry sells to Canada drugs at a discounted price. We're paying the full load, and these countries are free riding off us, which is really annoying. And Wayne and I write about this a lot. But they have, in Canada, has not only does the government fully run the healthcare system under single payer system, there's no private healthcare for anything considered medically necessary, but there's the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board, which decides at the discounted price if that drug is still too expensive or whether it's worthy of sending it out to the provinces so they can include that drug on their formulary. So they have a board that makes it very, very difficult. And many of these drugs just aren't available, and it's sad for patients. A lot of patients come to the U.S. I know a lot of people who have illnesses that there are drugs that can take care of it, that they come to the United States and pay out of pocket because they're not available in Canada.
Yeah. And the reverse of that, because you see all these policies that we want to allow people to purchase drugs from Canada, but if they're not available, you can't purchase something that doesn't exist.
Well, exactly. And, I mean, even Mr. Trump in his past administration was talking about importing drugs from Canada. DeSantis signed that bill in Florida, allowing for drug importation. At this point, after 5 years, not one single drug has been imported into Florida from Canada. And as the Canadian health minister said, we don't have enough drugs for our own people. We're not going to start selling them to patients in the United States. So, and just one other point, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry has really been very innovative in illnesses like cancer, dementia, strokes, and healthcare. And I've just been reading recently how there are many new vaccines being researched and developed in this country for ovarian cancer, which is a death knell, for colon cancer, and for breast cancer. So it's very exciting. These are diseases that are, not always life-threatening, but can be. And, if you look at cancer between 91 and 2023, the United States cancer death rate fell by 33%. But in the UK, for example, because of the National Health Service, the long waits for care, the long waits for testing, only 19%. The death rate has only fallen by 19%. So we want to remember, President Biden talked about the cancer moonshot. Well, that never came to be. And he was bringing in price controls, which, of course, would be the death knell of the cancer moonshot. But we want to get cancer under control in this country and allow people all over the world to survive and live long and healthy lives.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, where it's the drug price controls, like in the UK and Canada, they are blocking people access. But if we were to implement the price controls, and you go into this in the book, that would actually just put a huge damper on all future innovation.
Well, and as I always talk about when I'm talking to the media about single payer healthcare, Bernie Sanders, the Pied Piper of single payer, and also the Pied Piper of wanting cheaper drugs in this country. But if we get single payer in this country, where will we go to get our healthcare? And the same thing will happen. Where will the drug industry and where will the research and development go if it's not done in America? There are very few, I can't even think of a single country where this great innovation will happen. So it would put a stoppage on development of the latest vaccines, the latest biologics, the latest small molecule drugs as well.
Yeah, and this is something you talk about in the book, and I was hoping you could share some of the experiences, because it's really patients who are going to suffer the most when innovation is thwarted. And I think, those are patients that drugs exist so that they're harmed because they don't have access to it. And I think this is a really important perspective, that it's also patients who are waiting for that miracle therapy that won't come. right? This is not an innovation versus patient perspective. This is patients today versus patients tomorrow perspective. And you go into this in the book, and you have some really, really wonderful examples, wonderful in terms of showing it. They're actually tragedies, but examples from Canada and the UK. And I was hoping you could share some of those impacts on patients that occur when you have these drug price controls.
Right. So, as I mentioned, Britain, the government took over the healthcare system under the National Health Service in 1948. So it's been around a long time. There are over 8 million Brits who are on waiting lists today. And Wes Streeting, the Minister of Health in the UK, has said it's a disastrous situation. And of course, the royal family doesn't wait on a list, the National Health Service waiting list. They use the private system and get their treatments and care right away. So, of course, in Canada there is no private healthcare. But what I would say is, not only did the UK take over the start the National Health Service in 48, they also in 1999 brought in an organization which Wayne has written a lot about, and its counterpart here in the US. It's called NICE, and it is anything but nice. NICE is the National Institutes for Health and Clinical Excellence. This is an organization in the UK that says, all right, Wayne Weingarten, you're 35 years old and you've been diagnosed with cancer. We think you're worth, the government agency says Wayne Weingarten's worth about $40,000 a year. Of course, he's worth with me more than that. But the cancer drug that he needs is actually would cost $50,000 a year. So NICE would say, in a not very nice way, I'm sorry, Wayne, but we've worked out your quality adjusted life value, and you're not eligible for that drug. And here in America, there's an organization based in Boston called ICER. It is a similar organization that the ICER, they want to get sort of a quality program going here in the United States. And Wayne has done a lot of work showing why this would be a terrible idea. But, if you're looking at examples in my book, I talk about Leqembi, which is an Alzheimer's drug. It took a lot longer to get it approved in the UK. And when it finally did, the National Health Service said, well, it's still too expensive. We're not going to cover it. My own uncle died from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1999. And his son, who's my cousin, who is a medical doctor, got in touch and said, well, what do you know about treatments for NHL? And so Rituxan was the new drug on the market, and it was proving effective. And so David knew the head of the Cancer Control Agency in Vancouver, and he went to the Cancer Control Agency, said, well, can we get Rituxan for my father? And he said, well, I've never heard of it. He spent 2 weeks looking into it and said, well, it's just not available. It hasn't been approved for the formulary here. But, you could take your dad, drive to Seattle, Washington, cross the border, go to the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Clinic in Seattle, Washington. And of course, it's a problem. You don't want to be driving for 2 hours, waiting at the border, and then, to get treatment. And he was too weak and ill. So sadly, he died from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and didn't have access to Rituxan. Eventually, Rituxan did make it on the formulary in Canada. But as I mentioned, so many drugs that are available here, only 28% are available in Canada, and we have access to 74%. So there's so many stories about treatments that aren't available to people in countries like England and Canada and Germany and France that we have access to, and we've got to keep this engine alive and well for all of us, because, as I said, where will the R&D go if we have price controls in this country? Wayne and I will be unemployed, and we may not even live as long as we should.
Well, and there's something else that's very short-sighted with price controls, and you even have publications by the federal government that document this, where if you spend more on drugs, you actually are going to make savings elsewhere in the healthcare system, and so you can be short-sighted, or penny wise but pound foolish by price controlling drugs, but causing other expenditures to increase.
Well, exactly. And people need to understand that. I mean, Senator Sanders gets, well, what he just has stepped down as chairman of the Senate Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. But if he wasn't on the stump talking about single payer and why we needed it in this country, he was on the stump saying, you people are being taken to the cleaners with the price of drugs. And he'd say, well, Eliquis, the Bristol Myers Squibb Pfizer drug for blood clots, he would say, well, that's $690 a month, and that's absolutely ridiculous. Of course, he's talking about list price, and we can talk about this later, the role of PBMs, but most people don't pay the list price, they pay the net price. And 90% of American drugs consumed are generics. Those are drugs that are off patent, that can be copied, complete copy, and very, very inexpensive.
We'll get back to next round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Right. Oh, yeah. The average price of a generic is about $20.
Yeah.
So for most medicines purchased are affordable. It's the kind of the tails that are actually impacting people. I think it's actually a great time to go into you talking about pharmacy benefit managers, because the people who are there is something wrong with our drug pricing system, I guess is the way to put it. And so yeah, maybe you can kind of go into what is happening. Why are some people so worried about drug price costs?
Well, Wayne, you are the PBM expert and I'm just your understudy. But I mean, how many people talk about PBMs at the dinner table? Very few. PBMs are pharmaceutical benefit managers. They're middlemen, just like the health insurers are middlemen between patients and doctors. PBMs are the middlemen in the pharmaceutical industry. PBMs negotiate the price, the net price for a drug between a health insurer and a pharmaceutical manufacturer. And so the PBMs want to keep the rebates, they want to keep the list price high. So they want the rebates and discounts to be small so that the price that the net price is higher. And so as a result, when the price is higher, the PBMs, the middlemen, and the insurer make a lot more money. And the benefits from these negotiations should be going to the patient when the patient goes to the drugstore to get their drugs. So there's actually bipartisan support in Congress and here in California on PBM reform. I think there should be a set price for the PBMs to get, rather than allowing them to do spread pricing and all kinds of evil things that keep the discount and the rebate going to the patient. So there, as I say, there is interest in this. In Congress and in the California legislature, there are 3 PBMs that control 80% of the PBM market: Express Scripts, which is owned by Cigna; CVS Caremark, which is owned by CVS; and the last one is Optum, which is part of United Health. They are sort of the 800-pound gorillas in this drug pricing issue. And so we want to make sure that we get this reformed so that patients receive the net price at the pharmaceutical counter, rather than paying a much higher price than they need to. And I guess I would say that most people pay the net price, they don't pay the list price. I mean, that the number, most 170 million Americans have their health insurance, get their health insurance through their employer. So most people have pharmaceutical coverage under their health insurance package. And if you're on Medicare or Medicaid, you also get your drugs at a much lower price. So this is a very important issue. We want to have people to have access to the very best treatments and allow them to be there. So we need PBM reform, and we need 340B reform, which is another issue that Wayne talks about a lot. 340B is another program people don't talk about at the dinner table, but it is a program that was started by the government to help rural hospitals with large low-income populations to get drugs at discounted prices so they could afford and get these drugs. But what's happened is, over time, like in anything, government just like Topsy growed and growed, and the large hospital conglomerates are taking advantage of the 340B program. And so therefore, there's not as much money left for the rural hospitals that really need it for their low-income populations.
Right. And I think something that's really important to emphasize with the PBM that you were going through, which is this is not a free market situation, because you'll see, the argument and justification for PBMs, they'll say, well, it's a free market. And so, why are you against free market companies, working? And the idea is that these are kind of cronyist responses to a third-party payer system that is dominated by the government. And you would never have this type of situation in a free market, because the incentives of the PBMs are so misaligned with the incentives of the patients, because the patients don't want to see those high list prices, because what often happens is you'll have your co-insurance off a high list price. So patients will pay more, even though the prices haven't been going up. I mean, I think it always amazes me when you say the net prices of drugs have been declining, especially adjusted for inflation, for the past 8 years. And if you say that to people, I think they'd be shocked, because their out of pockets on those expensive drugs may not be, but that's the reality. And that's the misalignment of incentives that you were talking about, that I think is just so important to emphasize when you talk about PBMs. And 340B as well. I mean, one of the things that amazes me about that program is, here's a program that's supposed to be supporting hospitals and clinics that serve low-income people, and yet the average 340B institution provides less charity care than the average non-340B hospital. And so when you get situations like this, like you were saying, it's the government having taken a program and just allowed it to metastasize to something that's just beyond what it's supposed to achieve.
Exactly. Yeah. And the whole spread, if one study has shown that if the spread pricing would be eliminated, oftentimes the PBMs will pay a health insurer a better rate than the drugstore gets. So if they eliminated this spread pricing idea, Medicare could save $929 million over a decade just by getting rid of that one part of the PBM nightmare.
And so these are the types of, and I was going to talk about this later, but you've hit it already, which is, what are the free market type reforms? And it's really where you see elsewhere in the economy where middlemen are being squeezed and that we're gaining efficiencies. It's overwhelming that in the drug market, we actually see the middleman's power is expanding. And that's just in contradiction to what we're seeing elsewhere. And so these types of reforms, they're going to allow the free market to actually work more effectively, which is really important. Something else that you talk about that I think would be interesting to get into is reforms to the FDA approval process, because the FDA, they serve a vital role. Yet it's possible to kind of reduce the costs and the time it requires for a drug manufacturer to obtain FDA approval. And there would be a lot of benefits, both in terms of costs of drugs, but in terms of getting drugs to patients faster if we had those types of reforms. So I was hoping you could spend a little bit of time talking about that as well.
Yeah, the FDA. We've been talking about that for a long time, FDA reform. And, back in the day, my mentor, Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate in economics, we'd have a dinner table conversation and he'd say, Sally, you talk about getting rid of the FDA, it'll never happen. The FDA, but originally was introduced as a safety organization, and the FDA was very effective in denying thalidomide coming to market here in America, where it caused, in Europe and in Canada, there were a lot of children who were affected by the thalidomide situation by young pregnant women. But he said the problem with the FDA is it moved away from safety to including effectiveness or efficacy. And so, this has really made it very difficult. And as I say, 1 in 10 drugs makes it through the whole trial process, and it takes about 12 years. So, Wayne, as you know, the 21st Century Cures Act, which you wrote a lot about back in 2016, which was passed, it called on the FDA to expedite and modernize the review process and to harness real world evidence and give special attention to innovative and emerging areas of drug research and regenerative medicine. I'm kind of I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Marty Makary is confirmed as he's been nominated, confirmed as head of the FDA. He's a Johns Hopkins doctor, and he's very good on these things, and he can work to get the process streamlined. There are way too many people. I mean, Mr. Musk and the Doge has said the FDA and the CDC have way too many employees, but Makary could really work to make permanent the accelerated approval pathway, which was passed so that people who are in terminal situations and they're not going to survive, and there are some new drugs under review. They haven't been approved by the FDA, but they could prove they've shown clinical benefit, and so these people that are very, very ill would be allowed to use these drugs that are part of the accelerated approval pathway. And I'm hoping that he will make that permanent, so that some people that are terminally ill will be able to get access to drugs that aren't approved yet by the FDA, but will allow them to live longer and one would hope healthier lives.
Right.
So the FDA definitely, I mean, so many of us have been writing about the FDA and the problems it causes, but it is a huge, giant bureaucracy in Washington, D.C.
So I'd like to dig in a little bit you were talking about the safety versus efficacy. And I think that's worth emphasizing, because that could significantly speed up the approval process. So would the standard then just be, as long as it's safe, that the drug can then be prescribed and allow clinicians to see what its effectiveness is in actual usage? Is that the thinking?
I think that is it. And as we saw, as I said, the COVID pandemic was sort of declared in April of 2020, and Operation Warp Speed, we were able to get the Pfizer Moderna vaccines, to market, so that 70% of people around the world had access to the first vaccine. If these vaccines had gone through the normal approval process, we still might not have approval of these drugs, which really helped control the pandemic. Of course, Wayne, you and I are against mandating that people have to have vaccines and making it so you couldn't get on a plane or go to this country if you didn't have your vaccine card with you, which was absolutely ridiculous. But we want to keep the market open, but we want to have access to these new vaccines and drugs. And if let people make their own decisions about whether they want to use them or not. But we've certainly seen Robert Kennedy Jr. was confirmed as Secretary of HHS. It's going to be interesting to see. I think he's reneging on some of the promises he made to Senator Bill Cassidy on vaccinations. But if you read the news, top story every morning is that, measles, there's an outbreak of measles in West Texas, and there are 124 cases. The first young child just died from measles. And most of these kids who've come down with measles are those who are unvaccinated or they don't know. But one thing we do know is that a lot of mothers have been listening to Robert Kennedy Jr. On the stump saying vaccinations are bad and we need to ban them. Well, they take that into their heart and say, well, I'm not going to get my child vaccinated for measles, mumps, chickenpox, smallpox, polio. Though many of those diseases which were eradicated. We don't want these diseases to come back. And so I think we need to educate the American public on why these illnesses were eradicated and why we need to keep them out of our country.
Right, and I think that's an incredibly important point, and incredibly important distinction between the education on vaccines and the getting out the correct information versus a mandate, right? That undoubtedly mandates, there's all sorts of issues with it, but when you have something that's efficacious, and how important it is to differentiate that, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have to get the vaccine, but it certainly is, from a kind of scientific perspective, will increase your chances of being healthy and you say getting rid of these really awful diseases.
I mean, if you look at a condition called shingles, which affects mainly older people, but Wayne, you had shingles. And so Milton Friedman had shingles. This was before GSK's first shingle shot. And he said he had the worst pain he'd ever had in his whole life was a pain he had when he had shingles. And so now there is a two-part vaccination for shingles. I've had it. I think most people have. It is a very terrible, painful disease. And my own uncle in Canada, the one who died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, I mean, he came down with shingles and was left blind in one eye. The vaccine was not available at that time. And it's a terrible disease. So, it's fine for people to say, shingles, I'd rather not have the vaccination. Well, for those people who've had shingles, they would definitely say the vaccine is worth it.
Yeah, I was actually lucky. It almost hit one of my eyes, which would have been very problematic. And I was actually because of my case, I know of at least a half dozen people who went out right away and got their shingles vaccine because they didn't want to go through what I was going through.
Right. And Wayne, we couldn't afford for you to lose one of your eyes. You'd only be able to do half the work that you do for PRI every day of the week.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
So I guess with that, Tim, I'd like to ask if there's any questions from the audience.
Okay, let me, we have one good question here, which I think is a very interesting one. So, beyond the economic benefits, pharma companies make so many life-saving and life-extending therapies. And so the question here is, in your view, and maybe this is more of a kind of a public relations question, why are they so hated by Hollywood and the media and politicians, given that they do such good?
Well, I guess I could start on that because the people like on the progressive left have Bernie Sanders and AOC all talk about big pharma. It sounds like a scary organization instead of focusing on what, as you just mentioned, Tim, the benefits that we all receive from big pharma. And, big pharma, first of all, if you're a researcher or a research scientist, and say you're Tim and I are working in your little lab at home, and you think, I've got a cure for colon cancer. Well, you do not have the resources as little Tim and I in your research station at home to go to the patent office and get a patent for your idea. And as I said, 2.8 billion from the idea to market. So a lot of the pharmaceutical companies buy small research companies, and so they become part of big pharma, but they also lead to terrific cures that are good for all of us. But they start small, and then they join pharma, and it's a very a terrific process. And it's just the left doesn't like, for some reason, they don't like anything that's big other than big Hollywood. I don't know, Wayne, if you want to add something to that.
I guess what I would add is that, being an economist, right? So to a hammer, everything is a nail. I imagine part of the problem is people don't understand the concept of the cost of capital. They don't understand that it takes 15 years to develop a drug, the risks of developing the drug, so that there's a capital cost, and that you're not going to get the resources devoted to drug kind of development if you don't have an opportunity to cover that cost of capital. And if you personalize it, right? If you had a choice to invest in pharmaceutical company A, but there's price controls, or you can invest in NVIDIA, right, and participate in the AI revolution, well, you're thinking about your retirement, you're going to put it into AI because that's got a potential return so that you'll be able to have a comfortable retirement. So when you're competing with kind of all of these other uses of capital, you have to be able to cover that cost. And people don't understand that. They get scared by it, I think, to some extent. And so there's that perspective that's missing. I think what's also missing is that people do recognize that there's something wrong. What's wrong is the way our insurance and our payment systems are working, right? We don't actually have health insurance in this country. We have prepaid health care. And so that creates all sorts of problems that manifest all over the place. And drugs are a visible part of that. And so people see that and they'll focus on that, but that's not really what's driving the problem. They have to differentiate between kind of what's driving the problem and kind of what do they visibly see. So until we actually fix that third-party payer system, all sorts of issues are going to keep creeping up. If we slapped price controls on every drug in this country, we'd still have all sorts of problems. Healthcare quality would be declining actually at a faster rate. We would not have solved the underlying problem. And until we address that, until we address the flaws of the third-party payer system and the fact that we don't have health insurance, we have prepaid care, we're never going to get to that kind of stable place we're looking for.
Well, and the government got us into this mess during World War II when wage and price controls were in. Employers couldn't hire people. So one of the things was the federal government allowed them to provide health insurance, and that's a tax benefit. Of course, we get lower wages if we get health insurance through our employer, but really we don't get our car insurance, our life insurance, our long-term care coverage through the government, and we shouldn't through the government. We shouldn't be getting our health insurance through our employer, but that's an issue for another day. And people get mad at me when I talk about it, but really because they think, well, I like my health coverage, and I like my drug coverage that I have from my health insurance. But basically, this has really caused a distortion in the market, and we have middlemen between patients and doctors, and we have middlemen in the pharmaceutical industry as well. And middlemen raise the price and reduce the quality and quantity of care that we can receive.
It's like that game of telephone we played when we were kids, right? When you have too many middlemen, the message doesn't get from point A to point B; it gets distorted. That's exactly what's happening to our healthcare system, drugs included.
Yeah.
Well, on Sally's point, PRI does a healthcare satisfaction survey every year. And if you go to pacificresearch.org, you can check out our most recent poll, which came out in the fall. And to her point, routinely, it's something like around 90% of Americans, when we ask, they're satisfied with their current health coverage.
And if you tell them, if they say at 60% they like the idea of single payer healthcare, and then you say, well, you're going to have to pay much higher taxes. I mean, the average Canadian, while there is no private coverage, pays $17,717 a year in hidden taxes for coverage where you are on a waiting list and denied treatment. So when they're told that, then the support for single payer goes way down to the low 30% range, because they think, oh, single payer, it's free, but somebody has to pay for it, and government doesn't have the money. We, the taxpayer, pay for these programs.
That's right. And a reminder to our listeners, if you have any questions, please put them in the Zoom Q&A function, and I will ask them for you. Wayne, I was wondering if you could follow up on your point that you were making about, they don't see really the value that goes into all of the innovation and the research and development. I wonder if it's the average person doesn't see that the drug maker is the innovator. They think the government's doing all of this research. So could you talk about distinguish? I know it's something you've written and we've talked about in the past, kind of the difference between what research is the government doing into these life-saving cares and what really are, why are, drug companies really the life-saving innovators here?
Right. I mean, that comes from a talking point. And it was actually, I think, a very effective talking point because it persists. I mean, absolutely, there's a public good, right? Basic research is a public good. And that's what NIH conducts, right? Through the government, we do very important basic research. And that's what they should be doing. That's their role. Now, there's been all sorts of legislation, and Sally can speak to these very well, that has enabled the private sector to take that basic research that the government produces and create innovative drugs that actually help us. And before the Bayh-Dole Act, right, you weren't getting that basic research wasn't being used because the property rights were uncertain and there were still large amounts of capital costs that the private sector had to put into it in order to create these ideas, these basic scientific ideas, and turn them into medicines. And every year, the private sector pharmaceutical industry and biopharmaceutical industry, they have 8 to 10 times the amount of money invested in R&D research compared to how much the government is spending on basic research. So this idea that it's the government that funds it is just patently false. The government is doing what it's supposed to do, right? It is doing basic research, but it takes 8, 10 times as much money every year that the private sector is putting into it in order to take those concepts and then turn them into medicines that help patients. And we have, from historical experience, we know that without that process, without the incentives for the private sector to make those investments, those great ideas don't go anywhere. They don't actually help anyone. It's the whole, if a tree falls in the wood and nobody hears it, that old adage. That's what's happening without the incentives for the private sector to fund it. But they do the lion's share of the work that turns it into medicines. There's just no doubt about that.
And I would just add that Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford is the nominee for being head of NIH. And I think if he is confirmed, and I hope he will be, I think he'll be a terrific advocate for those of us who support research and development and less on big government. It's interesting that Mr. Trump has an executive order where the NIH will have this reduction in administrative costs from 50% of the grant that they get down to 15%. And everyone is like, research and development in medicines is going to end. No, this is taking down from 50% to 15% the administrative costs that all these research institutions take off the top before the researcher like Wayne at say Weill Cornell Medical School would get. So this is a terrific idea. It's absolutely ridiculous how much the administrators take off the top of these grants that come in to the NIH. So I'm excited that this might actually happen. Give more money to the researchers and less to government bureaucrats.
That's right. So I have two kind of similar questions that I'm going to combine into one, and I think it's a good question kind of in our discussion on. So we had a question come in about, obviously, right, we're spending 45 minutes to an hour talking through these things. Sally just wrote a whole book on these topics. This isn't slogan kind of stuff here, right? There are sometimes complex things that we need to kind of break down and go through here. So the question we had is, how do we get the word out? How do we change hearts and minds on this? And when you look at, we're in a new political world in Washington these days. You have unified GOP control. But as we've discussed before here, right, you're seeing Republicans increasingly likely to go along with Democrats in this push for government control. So, A, how do we change hearts and minds here? But B, given the political dynamic, what do you think is the potential going forward to adopt the types of reforms that you talk about in your book?
Well, I mean, this is a very important question. And it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. How do we educate the American people so that they understand what we're talking about? I mean, it's just so important. I mean, one of the things, my book is out there. I'm doing 2 to 3 podcasts, radio interviews, articles, op-eds to educate the American people, trying to put the message in a way that it is understandable to the Pitts family, the person in the street, as we used to say at the Fraser Institute, because it is complicated. And people their eyes just glaze over when you think of PBMs, price controls. What does this all mean? And so it's very, very important that we reach out through all kinds of media media in order to educate the American people on these issues. And as you say, I mean, the Republicans have control of the three parts of the president, the House and the Senate, the House and Senate, small majorities. But, I mean, I'm concerned. I mean, is the White House going to actually band together and say, we need to get rid of the price controls under Medicare Parts B and D and B, and actually then make the message to Congress? Because right now, I'm not hearing anything out of the White House on that. And if the White House doesn't push it to the Senate and the House, is anything going to happen? And before you know it, we'll have these price controls in January 2026, 2027, going right through to 2029. And then, well, we have price controls on these. There will be less new drugs. We might as well do it on all drugs, just like happened in Europe, and how they lost their research and development innovation in those countries because of price controls.
Wayne, do you have any thoughts on that as we close?
Well, I think Sally, what she said is 100% correct. I'd say read her book as well. But I guess I would also add, my dissertation professor many decades ago said to me that there's no response if somebody says your writing is unclear. Because if they don't understand it, you can't say, no, you do understand it. And so I think part of it is we need to take that feedback, that if people aren't getting the message, and it's incumbent upon us to, well, how do we explain this in a manner that's more straightforward, that's simpler, that gets the message across, that makes people understand that innovation is talking about patients and explaining that, and the empathy of living with somebody. If somebody is living with pancreatic cancer and their family is dealing with that, when you talk about innovation, that's what you're talking about. You're not talking about a scientist in the lab or some fat cat pharmaceutical executive, and that's what Bernie Sanders wants to talk about. But what you're really talking about is the patient who's living with this untreated disease that's terminal. And how can we, if we can't get in time to save them, how can we save the next generation to stop that type of carnage? And I think reframing it so that people understand that that's what we're talking about is an important first step.
I mean, it's like we've had this discussion many times before, trying to break down down these issues.
Tim, because history doesn't repeat itself. It's the same damn thing over and over again, and we have to keep hammering away at it.
That's right. Well, we're thrilled you're continuing to hammer away at it and travel the country and go on all these shows and educate people why these government healthcare mandates and government healthcare policies are so bad for patients, and why the free market is the way to go forward. So, Sally, thank you. Wayne, thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.